in the 65 to 66 time frame, you had these sightings, which caused Congress to direct the Air Force to hold an independent study. And it would be obvious that that would only happen if you had cases that couldn't be explained, or didn't seem to be explainable at least. If you could explain all the cases and everybody accepted the explanations, then there would be no UFO subject.
Ladies and gentlemen, below of America!
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Banal of America Audio, with your host, Tim Banal.
What is going on, my friends? This is Tim Banal of banalofamerica.com with another edition of BOA Audio Season 5, coming at you a little later than I would have liked to, but that is because I'm working on a very big project. Let me plug it here at the beginning of the show for folks who are unfamiliar with this big news. I'm going to be serving as the MC at the upcoming Exeter UFO Festival in Exeter, New Hampshire, Saturday, September 4th. It is going to be an amazing event. Speakers include Stanton Friedman, Peter Robbins, and Phil Imbrogno, as well as Steve Fermani from New England MUFON and the Exeter UFO Hall of Fame, plus a whole bunch of fun and games for kids, crafts, costumes, parades, all kinds of cool stuff. And best of all, folks, the whole shebang is totally free. This really is a tremendous opportunity for anybody in the New England area, New York, Pennsylvania, all those places, to check out an awesome UFO show for just the cost of how you get up there. If you want to find out more about the big event, go to www.exeterufofestival.com, Exeter, E-X-E-T-E-R, UFOfestival.com. Check it out, find out more about the event, and if you plan to make the trip up to Exeter, shoot me an email. I'd love to meet you, and I'm going to be having beers and stuff and partying my ass off on Saturday night, so anybody that's in the area and wants to get down and boogie, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to let you know where the party will be at. Alright, now that I've got that gratuitous plug out of the way, let's get down to business here with this week's edition of the program. It is episode 2 of the final 4 of season 5, and we have got another A-list superstar guest. And beyond that, an interview that's really long overdue here for BOA Audio. I'm talking about legendary ufologist Dr. Bruce Maccabee. He is here with us on the program to talk about his amazing career investigating the UFO phenomenon. He's been in this field since the late 1960s. That's 40 plus years, folks. And as you may expect here with BOA Audio, we're going to be delving into his whole career and a whole bunch of different areas of his remarkable tenure in the field of ufology. Here's the gist of what we're going to be talking about. We'll find out how he first got interested in this subject. He shares some really cool stories about what it was like in the late 1960s in ufology. He'll talk about some of the early cases he investigated. He'll give us his take on the evolution of the field over the last 4 decades, including the paradigm shift of ufology in the 1980s. He'll really go in depth on his battles with debunker Phil Klass, some great stories in there. We'll get his perspective on this digital age and how that applies to UFO photographs. A lot of people write them off since anything can be faked. We get his opinion on that argument. We'll also cover the importance of UFO documents gleaned from the government and, of course, tons and tons more, including specific cases that he's investigated, such as the McMinnville photos, the 1978 New Zealand sightings, and the JAL case of 1986. Altogether, it's a journey through the last 4 decades of ufology with a man who has had a front row seat to the field's evolution, the legendary Dr. Bruce Maccabee. For those of you unfamiliar with Dr. Bruce Maccabee, quite frankly, his resume is stacked, as is his bio. Suffice it to say, he received his PhD in physics from American University in Washington, D.C. in 1970, and in 1972 he commenced his long career at the Naval Surface Warfare Center. He's been active in the UFO research field since the late 1960s when he joined NICAP. and was active in research and investigation for NICAP until its demise in 1980. He became a member of MUFON in 1975 and was appointed to the position of State Director of Maryland, a position he still holds. And in 1979, he was instrumental in establishing the Fund for UFO Research and was the chairman there for about 13 years. But wait, there's more, because Dr. Bruce Maccabee is the author or co-author of about 36 technical articles and more than 100 UFO articles over the last 25 years. He's the co-author of UFOs Are Real, Here's the Proof. He's the author of the UFO FBI Connection, and he's the author of the novel Abduction in My Life. So, talk about a decorated career, my friends. That is some serious accomplishment and contribution to this enigmatic field. He really has put in just yeoman's work over the last 40 plus years. I highly encourage you to dive into his website, which you can find at www.brumac.8k.com. Let me spell that one out for you. It's a bit technical. BRUMAC.8, then the letter K.com. brumac.8k.com. Check it out. And you've been waiting long enough, so let's get cooking, folks. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on August 6th, 2010. Dr. Bruce Maccabee, talking about his 40-plus year career researching the UFO phenomenon on BOA Audio, Season 5. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Banal of America Audio. We are marching towards the season finale here, and I am very excited about this week's guest. I am stunned, really, and embarrassed, to be honest with you folks, that it has taken me 5 years to get this guy on the program. He really is a legend in the world of ufology. He's been a part of the field since the late 1960s. Chances are, if you've been in the field for a while, if you've looked at the history of the field, or even just taken a look around at who are the dignitaries of ufology, you know this guy very well. He's the author of UFO/FBI Connection, UFOs Are Real, Here's the Proof, and he's also written countless articles on the subject of UFOs, and he's primarily known for his study of UFO photography, which is a result of his long and esteemed career with the U.S. Navy doing a number of different things in optical physics. So without any further ado, please let me welcome somebody that I've wanted to talk to for quite a while. Very excited to discuss his career as a ufologist. Dr. Bruce Maccabee, welcome to BOA Audio, and thank you humbly, sir, for coming on the program.
Thank you for inviting me, and let me mention one more book, Abduction in My Life, which was published in the year 2001.
That's right. That's your fiction book, right?
That's it's a unique book because it's a combination of fiction and fact, and it's written in such a way that you can tell what part is fiction and you can distinguish what part is fact. In fact, you could cut the fact book right out of the fiction book, paste all the fact pages together, and have yourself a fact book.
There you go. Just make sure you buy the book first. Don't do it at the bookstore.
It's a new type of literature called faction.
And didn't you also write a book on Tesla as well?
I did not write a book on Tesla. However, I have done a manuscript for a play or movie, and that's on my website if anybody is interested in what might be considered to be a stage play type of script.
Wow, you are just so prolific. And of course, everybody who's in the field of ufology knows about your tremendous talent as a pianist as well. So, I mean, this guy, he's just all over the place, folks, with the skills. And of course, the website is brumac.8k.com, and you spell Brumac pretty simply. Just take the beginning of Bruce Maccabee. It's BRUMAC.8k.com. Check that out. Well, let's start out, obviously you've had this just tremendously distinguished and decorated career in the world of ufology, but let's sort of start out by just what lit the fuse. What started your interest in this strange phenomenon? I know you became a player, I guess you could say, in the world of ufology in the late 1960s, but what sparked your interest in this anomalous aerial phenomena?
Well, I was going to school in Washington, D.C. in the 60s to get my PhD in physics. There was a period of time in 1965 and 66 when there was a flap of sightings going on. Everybody knew about it, and I read a book called UFOs, Serious Business, and thought, well, that was pretty interesting. Seemed reasonably convincing, anyway. So I read a couple other books, and I also attended a lecture, probably which was the key thing in making my life different from everybody else, I suppose. I attended a lecture by two guys from the National Investigating Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, that used to exist. In the 1960s, it was the largest civilian investigating group in the United States. And they had an office in the middle of in Washington, D.C., near a place called DuPont Circle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, two guys came and gave a lecture. I don't remember much about their lecture. In fact, I don't remember anything about it. The thing that stuck in my mind was they said, we need help, volunteer help, to do things like answer letters and open mail and stuff like that. Well, I figured they said they had about 10,000 cases on files, at the office. So I thought, well, if anybody knows what's going on, they probably do. Some weeks, I don't know how long it took me, several weeks after I heard this lecture, I decided to go down and see the big office. Well, I assumed it was big. After all, NICAP was mentioned in books. People knew about it all over the world.
Yeah.
So I went down to DuPont Circle and then out to New Hampshire Avenue, where it used to be 1536 New Hampshire Avenue, I think it was, and expecting to see a big office building with big room filled with secretaries and scientists running around doing all sorts of things. I just sort of had a nebulous idea of a big organization. So I come upon this row house, one segment of a row house with a door open that didn't even have an outer door on hinges, just an opening in the wall. And I walk up the stairs to go to the second floor, and there's an incandescent light bulb at the top of the stairs lighting my way. With a chain on it to pull if you wanted light. And I opened the door to the office, and I come into this small room packed from floor to ceiling with books and boxes and papers and all sorts of stuff. And a sort of a little broken down lady secretary who was running the whole show. Whatever happened to all the secretaries running around and the scientists and the music and the instruments for testing and photographic analysis and all that stuff? Well, it wasn't at NICAP. What I saw was a mere ghost or shadow of its former self. By the time I got there, Major Kehoe, who had essentially been running this organization for about, 10 years by the time I got there, his office was there, his desk was there, piled with junk, but he hadn't been there for a long time. The other main character of NICAP was Richard Hall, and then Don Berliner, and they weren't around either. NICAP had basically was on its way to collapse at that point. So anyway, I went there willing to do some work in exchange for being allowed to look through files. And I got to know this lady secretary, Isabel Davis, quite well. She turned out to be a very intelligent person, able to handle this whole operation herself practically. But she did need help with the volume of mail that was coming in.
Yeah.
And so I went there a number of times. I don't remember how often, every week, every other week, whatever, for a few hours, and did stuff. Of course, I had no background in the subject other than what I had read, but because I was studying physics, she thought I knew something. She asked me to put together a one-page fact sheet on UFOs, one sheet of paper on one side, and she would type whatever I wrote in tiny print. That was the reason for that was so you could just take a single sheet of paper, fold it, and triple fold it, and stick it in an envelope and mail it back to somebody who writes a letter saying, "Please send me everything you've got on UFOs." To which the correct answer is, "Send a truck."
Exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, several years later, when we were clearing out the office, as NICAP was shrinking and changing, the management was changing. I actually found one of my a copy of this document that I had written, so she had in fact typed it up and mailed it out to people.
That's great.
But anyway, because I was going to the office, I learned about the NICAP local subcommittee. NICAP worked, unlike MUFON that has state directors and county directors and field investigators and all that sort of stuff. NICAP had subcommittees in various areas throughout the United States, which did their investigative work. And so I joined the local Washington, D.C. subcommittee and got to go on some investigations with people who had done it before. And the first one that I went on involved some lady who claimed she saw green lights going over her car. She was driving along a road that's just outside the Beltway in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Or outside of Washington, D.C., actually. It's in Maryland. And so we went there, visited her house. It turned out to be a nice house. She was a teacher. Her husband was an accountant. Didn't sound like these people were likely to be hoaxing anything. And we got in her car, and we rode along the same road she went. There certainly was no reason for green lights to be passing over that road. So it was a hung jury. We didn't know, what do you make of a situation like that? Doesn't seem to be a hoax. Doesn't seem to be a misidentification. She saw this happen 2 or 3 times, she said. We just didn't know what it was that was passing over the road. Then I did a couple of other cases as a result of NICAP. Information that came to NICAP. Information usually got to the investigative groups days, weeks, months, or even years after they happened.
Yeah.
But we were fortunate to learn a story. A couple of members of the group had a friend down in Richmond, Virginia, a postman, who had heard from somebody else, who had heard from the witness in Mount Jackson, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, about a sighting. In other words, the information about this sighting went around the mill before we got to it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And then we found out who it was, contacted the person. I went there and investigated. That turned out to be a very interesting case of a man who was driving home after work. He was an elected official in a county in the Shenandoah Valley near Mount Jackson, Virginia. That's where he lived, is in Mount Jackson. Mm-hmm. And as he was driving to Mount Jackson from a place about 20 miles north, he saw a black spot. This was in the springtime. I think it was 1972 or 3. I forget the exact date. He was driving along, and he had a 10 or 20 mile, 10 mile or something like trip home, and he noticed this dark spot up above a mountain in a clear sky in the springtime. Clear blue sky, no clouds. And he sees this thing that appears to be over the mountaintop, the peak of a mountain, and as he drives along, it doesn't seem to be moving. He's getting closer and closer to it. Finally, he got to his house, and it was still there, but now instead of looking at it from a long distance, he was looking at it from maybe a couple of miles away, just looking upwards towards the top of this mountain. And then he got binoculars and looked at it, and he called his family out to look at it. The thing was there, and he drew a picture of it. It looked like a rocket with some sort of exhaust coming out one at the bottom end, but it wasn't going anywhere. So that turned out to be a pretty interesting case, and I, in fact, wrote it up and sent it into Science magazine as an article on UFOs after Science had done an article disparaging the whole subject.
That must have gone well.
Of course, my article didn't get very far.
Yeah,
so I'm thinking of posting it on my website, since it was the first thing that I wrote. And it's still a pretty good case. It wasn't really until 1973 that I really started to get into it in major depth.
Okay.
You may recall in 1973, well, the history of the subject, it started in 1947. The Air Force got involved right off the bat and went along doing things, investigating sightings without telling the general public about the cases that couldn't be explained. They only publicized the ones that could be explained.
Yeah.
That's a simplification and so on. But anyway, in 1952, there was a major flap of sightings, including over the Capitol, which a general in charge of Air Force intelligence, General Sanford, basically said everything was, as far as he was concerned, it was all a result of natural phenomena. The press ran with that, and that sort of established the tradition that there was nothing to UFOs. It was all misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions, mostly misidentifications by people who didn't know what they were looking at. And then in the middle 1960s, you had a flap of sightings in the Midwest, 65 and 66, in particular cases in Hillsdale, Michigan, in 1966, where Gerald Ford was the minority leader of the House. It was in his district. He lent his support to an order from Congress for the Air Force to support an independent investigation, which turned out to be the so-called Condon Report study. And that took place between 1967 and 1969, roughly.
Yeah.
For about $500,000, they wrote a report that has a lot of extraneous stuff in it it tackled about 90 cases, I think, and left about 1/3 of them unexplained. I was aware of all that. About the time that in 1965 and 66, as the Cunningham report was going on, it became legitimate to talk about the subject without having a bag over your head. And that's why I went down to this lecture at NICAP, because UFOs were in the news. As I said, I had read a book, UFOs Serious Business, and had read a couple other books as well. So anyway, in 1969, the Cunningham report was published and basically said, well, we looked real hard and there's nothing to it. That was Condon's opinion. And there'd be no reason for a continued investigation, and the Air Force should get out of the business. So the Air Force closed Project Blue Book at the end of 1969. And at that point, it looked like UFOs had gone away forever. There had been a flap of sightings in 65 and 66, and after that, the number of sightings per year sort of dropped. Those of us keeping track of sighting reports, for example, like NICAP, continued publishing the UFO Investigator that they published, containing UFO reports, but you only knew about UFO reports if you were one of the members of a UFO group that was collecting them.
Yeah.
Unlike the 65 to 66 time frame with a flap, where UFO reports were published in the newspapers, nothing was being published in 69, 70, 71, and 72. As I said, people with their ear to the ground knew that there were things going on, but it wasn't making it into the general public. Then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose in the fall of 1973. I don't know if you were around at that point.
Oh, no. I was still a gleam in my daddy's eye then.
Well, in 1973, in August, late August of 1973, all of a sudden police reports were coming in the Carolinas and so on. And then this wave of sightings sort of moved its way westward and northward through the United States. And there are a couple of famous cases that came out of that. One of them was the Hickson-Parker Pascagoula, Mississippi abduction. These two men were fishing in the Pascagoula River, claimed that an object settled down behind them. Creatures came out, floated them into the object, examined them, and floated them back onto the dock where they were fishing, and took off. And the sheriff put them in a room with a tape recorder, assuming that they would be saying things like, well, we've got them now, give away their secrets of how trying to create a UFO hoax. Instead, they simply talked about whether or not they would be believed and what are they going to do now, having had all this thing happen.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, there was another case also, a military helicopter case, known as the Coin helicopter case. After the name of the guy who was in charge of the helicopter. 8 Army medical people who had just gone for their medical examinations were flying in a helicopter over central Ohio, and as they approached Mansfield, Ohio, saw some bright object off in the distance that suddenly came close to them and appeared to hover over them, and the pilot, to avoid this object, put the helicopter into a dive. And he saw this thing hovering up above them, and suddenly it left. And when it left, he looked at his altitude, and he was actually up higher than he had been when he started. So that scene apparently was witnessed from the ground. That was a couple of major cases. And because of this big flap, it became apparent that UFOs hadn't gone away.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. So when... go ahead.
Yeah, it was in the news. These are all cases in the newspapers. The newspapers couldn't avoid it at that point. And that's what gave me the incentive to try to write an article for Science magazine. That would have been, if they had accepted it, would have been published sometime in 1974. Because I had already done this case investigation from a 71 or 72 case, the Mount Jackson, Virginia case I mentioned, the guy seeing the thing hovering over a mountain. I wrote up a paper and sent it into Science magazine, and they said, thanks, but we got other things we can publish. You should send it somewhere else. So I published it in the highly truncated version in the UFO Investigator by NICAP. But it was at that point that I got seriously interested and started doing statistical analysis of a document known as Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. And I analyzed the Gemini 11 photo case that was reported in the Condon study. That was a Gemini 11 spacecraft in September 1966 that saw some object going past in front of them, and various other cases that led on to the beginning of my investigation of the McMinnville photograph case from 1950, probably the most famous photographs in UFO history because they're so clear, taken by a farmer and his wife. And then I got into some other cases, and then the New Zealand sightings came along that were famous at the time.
Oh, yeah.
New Zealand sightings of 1978, which followed the disappearance of pilot Valendich in Australia, which led to the New Zealand sightings. And after that, in the 1980s, also in the late 70s, I was one of the first people to make use of the Freedom of Information Act. And I got a bunch of stuff from the FBI, which was the core of the book that I wrote, UFO FBI Connection, that you mentioned earlier. And so things took off from there, you might say.
Yeah, the rest is history, as you might say.
The rest is history.
So, okay, so let's go. You've covered a lot here already, and I kind of want to go back and sort of get a little into the sociology of this. It sounds like when you first got involved here with NICAP, it was sort of on the wane, and then ufology, I don't like to think of it as this, but I feel that, sort of like the late 60s, early 70s, right about when you first got involved, was sort of really when ufology took a number of big hits with the Condon Report and Blue Book closes, James McDonald dies, NICAP starts sort of swirling down the drain. I guess my question for you is, you're sort of just getting into it then. What was the mood like around ufology? What were people, thinking? From what I understand, a lot of the hardcore serious scientists were starting to bail on the field at that point because it was sort of, especially when the Condon Report came out. It seems like it was quite an exodus from ufology as far as the serious scientists were concerned. So what was the mood like? That's really what I'm interested in here.
Well, I wasn't plugged in as well as people who had been in NICAP for a period of time.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt that the Condon Report was a major blow, and even though NICAP wrote a rebuttal to it, the rebuttal never gets the publicity or the attention that the original does. And, of course, the original was an official Air Force publication, and Condon had said he wasn't going to do this whole thing if it wouldn't be reviewed by the without a review from the National Academy of Sciences. And so the National Academy of Sciences reviewed this and said it was a good document. American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics set up a local UFO subgroup, acting totally independent on their own, reviewed the Condon Report and said it's obvious the Condon Report, the implication of the results of the Condon Report is that there ought to be a continued study, not stopping the study.
Yeah.
They pointed out that leaving about one third of the cases unexplained is not a good way of arguing that there's nothing there.
Yeah,
if you can't explain it. And they had some cases, if you actually read the Condon study, the case studies, you find some cases where they basically almost come right out and say, a photographic case, the McMinnville case, the reason I got interested in it was because the analyst said that everything investigated seemed to be consistent with the idea that an extraordinary flying object had passed within the sight of two witnesses. In other words, he was endorsing the case. Condon panned that particular case by pulling a bait and switch. Bill Hardman, who had done the analysis, made use of a technique known as photometry, which is essentially the study of relative brightnesses of things out there in a field. If you're going to take a photograph, there'll be bright things and dim things and so on. A photometer would tell you how much brightness there is.
Okay. Yeah.
Photometry is measuring brightness. Then, if you read Condon's summary of the report, which is right in the front of it, of course, you see that he talked to another photo analyst who looked at the McMinnville photos and said they were not sufficiently accurate for worthwhile photogrammetry. Now, photogrammetry is a study of angles and directions, lengths and sizes, and so on. It has nothing to do with the brightness.
Yeah.
You can have something that's dim or bright and have it be a certain size, or you can have one brightness for the same brightness for two different things in different directions or something. Direction and brightness are independent quantities. So Condon publicized this photogrammetrist's claim that it wasn't worthwhile for photogrammetry, but Hartman had used photometry. So that's why I say Condon sort of pulled a bait and switch type of thing. He talks about something that had nothing to do with the analysis done by Hartman. Anyway, that's one of the most egregious examples of Condon's trying to pull a wool over everybody's eyes.
Absolutely.
The fact that he never mentioned anything. All you had to do was go to the index and look under unexplained cases, and you'd find about 30 entries.
Unfortunately, everybody just seems to read the intro, right? That's
that's the point.
Yeah.
They read the first few pages where Condon said he didn't think that they had spent a lot of time and hadn't found anything, and he didn't think it would be worthwhile for studies to continue, and he recommended the Air Force get out of it. That was in the first page or two, and then there's a big long summary of the project, and Condon wrote the history section of the history of UFO sightings and so on. But anyway, yes, as far as the overall picture of the ufology is concerned, that was a big blow up to that point. And in fact, the big lead up was in the 65 to 66 time frame, you had these sightings, which caused Congress to direct the Air Force to hold an independent study. And it would be obvious that that would only happen if you had cases that couldn't be explained, or didn't seem to be explainable, at least. If you could explain all the cases and everybody accepted the explanations, then there would be no UFO subject. And you can make that argument going all the way back into 1947, when this whole thing began. If you could explain the first publicized sighting, that of Kenneth Arnold on June 24th, 1947, or all the sightings that occurred after that, several thousand of them that have been picked up in local papers throughout the United States and throughout the world. If you could convincingly explain them all, then nobody would have paid any attention to this subject.
Yeah. Now, go ahead.
It's the ones that you can't explain that keep this subject open.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's why we were still interested in this whole thing. Now, when you first got into it, did you have an opinion on what these UFOs were, or were you just curious about it? And how has your opinion changed over the years? I mean, you've been looking at this thing for 40 years. I mean, has it stayed the same? Has it changed? Has it evolved? Fill us in.
Well, I guess you might say I've been a nuts and bolts man all along. I realize there are variations on that, but it's long been my opinion that if one goes flying by and you throw a stone at it, you're going to hear it go boing. And in fact, there are cases that are like that, where there's one case in the middle 50s, I think it was, where a hunter a guy's out hunting in the woods, and he sees one of these coming along, and he shot at it, and he heard the bullet go careening off. That sounds pretty solid to me. Now, they nevertheless appear to be able to do things that we wouldn't be able to do with solids or liquids or gases, for that matter.
Yeah.
But I had sort of gone along with the NICAP point of view, which was that this was a nuts and bolts type of craft. NICAP, you might say for political reasons, tended to ignore cases that involved creatures.
Yeah.
Or contact of any sort.
Yeah, that was APRO territory, right?
Yeah, that was APRO territory. NICAP stuck with the most believable cases available. And, of course, Kehoe was a primary source of information for NICAP because of his connections going back into his first book in 1950. And then he'd written several books by the time NICAP began in 1957. And Kehoe was getting information from pilots and so on the inside. So what he was getting was pretty credible information.
Yeah. And,
of course, you had also in the mix, we have Ruppelt's book, the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, that came out in 1955. When I got interested in the subject in 1966 or 67, I recalled that I had read in high school a book, and I couldn't remember very much about it, but I rummaged through my old books and found Ruppelt's book that I had read in 1956 or 57, and Ruppelt's book was written by a guy who was the first director of Project Blue Book. And he cites a lot of cases. He cites the history of what the Air Force did and so on. It's still an important book to read if you're interested in the early history, because the mere fact that he wrote it is part of the early history and its impact on people who have studied the subject since. Even Arthur C. Clarke gave Ruppelt high grades for his book. Anyway, at the end of Ruppelt's book, you get the impression he's sitting on the fence. Is it real and extraterrestrial or not real? And you get the impression all it takes is a feather to knock him over onto the real extraterrestrial side. And that was sort of my opinion, too. If these things were real, they were nuts and bolts technology.
Yeah.
and I still stick with that. But I realize that there's a mental a mental aspect too, which I think was codified in 1981 or whatever it was with the publication of Missing Time.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
The early 1980s were sort of like a paradigm shift in the subject.
Yeah. Because
two things happened that had been sort of on the periphery of acceptability. From 1947 onwards, you had sightings of all sorts, and landings and landing traces and photographs and radar detections and all that sort of stuff. It was always something that was there for a while and then gone, not something that you could grab onto and say, here's a piece of it. Also, in most cases, you had the encounters similar to what Hynek talked about, close encounters. You see lights off in the distance, daylight disc type of sighting, something that might be within maybe a mile or less of you, and you can see some shape to it. And then encounters of various types, like seeing something land and create some mark, or seeing a creature. That was about it.
Yeah.
There were a few outlier cases. You had the Villas-Boas case from Brazil, written about by Carl Lorenzen, in which he claims he was out in the field on his tractor when his craft lands. He's taken into the craft and has relations with a semi-pretty, I guess, but very unusual female alien. And when he asks what's going to happen now, she points upwards, the implication being that she's going to have his child somewhere out there.
Yeah.
Villas-Boas died 10, 15 years ago. He was not a stupid kid farmer. He ended up being a lawyer.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, there was that case that nobody knew what to say about. And, of course, the Hill case, Betty and Barney Hill, that was investigated by some NICAP people, and yet they didn't know what to do with it. They couldn't really believe it. Then in the 70s, you had some other people writing about what are now called abduction cases. In the 50s, you had the contactees, and here's the reason why NICAP stuck to the nuts and bolts stuff. NICAP didn't want to sound ridiculous. You had Kehoe as a pilot and getting information from pilots, and they don't want to sound ridiculous. But you had Adamski and others in the 1950s claiming that the Space Brothers were coming to save us, and we should all ban the bomb and believe in Chevrolet and apple pie.
Yeah.
And everything would be sweetness and light. There were 4 or 5 people who traveled around the country and even around the world who were in this what are known as contactee situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so Kehoe and to a large extent APRO and other organizations wanted to stay away from that as much as they could because it didn't help their credibility.
Yeah, yeah.
But then in the 1970s, you had this situation occurring where there were people who said, well, we were taken on board, but they were not going out and publicizing that. You only found out by indirect means typically.
Yeah.
So many cases by direct recollection, but the bulk of the cases through hypnosis. By the 1970s, the contactees sort of faded out, I should say.
Yeah.
Replaced by abduction. They didn't hold the sway that they had back in the 50s and early 60s. But by the end of the 70s, you had the nuts and what I would call the nuts and bolts reports. A few others that were sort of bizarre. But the nuts and bolts reports, I should point out, violated physics in many cases. The implication was you have a solid object up there able to do a right angle turn, which is unphysical if it's a perfect right angle. You have to have infinite forces to stop something that's got mass and then accelerate it in another direction. I had not a personal, but a family report that was like that. I found out in the late 60s that my grandmother had a sighting probably in 1947, although we couldn't absolutely prove that, but only evidence pointed towards it.
Yeah.
In Greenfield, Massachusetts, where she was hanging out laundry one day. Now, to the east of her was a steeply rising small hill. It probably meant that her angle of elevation, she could see up to the top of the hill, her angle of elevation was maybe like 45 or 50 degrees. And she sees coming over this hill, heading westward, 2 round, shiny objects They were zipping along towards the west, and they suddenly made a right-angle turn and headed north. And Grandma wasn't an aerodynamicist or a physicist, but she knew that things don't make right-angle turns. So she told her family about it and told her friends, until a general anti-UFO reaction set in, at which point her husband told her to shut up.
Oh, man.
She never talked about it again, but she had told my mother by that point. So my mother knew about it, and I did get to interview my grandmother before she died about that particular sighting.
Now, as a classic nuts and bolts guy, what did you think of this explosion of abductions in the mid-'70s, and then, of course, they became big in the 80s?
That's why I said there was a paradigm shift.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that, and especially how you felt about it. I mean, most people know about the paradigm shift. I'm interested in, your perspective on it and what you were thinking as it all went down.
Well, I didn't know what to think. I was not involved in any cases that had to do with abduction.
Mm-hmm.
There was no connection, no photographic case that was related to it that was involved abduction at that point that I was aware of. I had heard about Bud Hopkins, and I knew something about his investigations of the sightings right in New Jersey, right across the river, almost from where he lived.
Yeah.
But I really wasn't thinking too much about it. And then two things happened as paradigm shift. One was the publication of the Roswell incident. By the time that was published, I was aware that they had located Jesse Marcel and learned about his testimony with regard to the Roswell case. And this was a paradigm shift because up to this point, nobody was seriously considering that the government was covering up hardware. There had been nothing about it. Those of you familiar with the Roswell case will know that it was mentioned very briefly in the newspapers in 1947, in July 8, 1947, and explained as a weather balloon, and that completely shut down the Roswell investigation for 30 years.
Yeah.
And when the book was published, and all of a sudden people start saying, well, wait a minute, it could be that there's the answer to this question of UFO reality is held by the government, and the government isn't saying anything.
Interesting. Okay,
so that was a new way of looking at things. Then I think it was in 1980 or 81, when Missing Time was published. And you read Missing Time, and here you find all of a sudden that Bud Hopkins has made some connections and important things, discoveries like the screen memory idea,
mm-hmm.
that people would remember something had happened, but they would be what they would remember was not exactly what had happened. There was a screen memory, and of course the thing that led to the title of the book, Missing Time, which comes immediately right out of the Betty and Bobby Hill case, where they were driving from up near in New Hampshire, up near Canada. They were driving home, and they get home. They figure 2 hours late. Can't figure out what happened to a couple hours worth of time. There were a number of cases like that, screen memory and the missing time, in his book. I got to talk to some of the witnesses that were the people that he was writing about, and they were impressive people. I mean, they clearly weren't contactees. They didn't really want any publicity. I guess he used pseudonyms for everybody that was in the book. One guy was a lawyer in the Washington, D.C. area, and he impressed me by saying his story was that he was driving to meet some people in a small town in Maryland that was west of Baltimore. And he was driving along a road called U.S. Route 40. And he drove out of Baltimore, heading west along Route 40, gets into a rural area, and he noticed this white light thing moving around in the sky that comes close to his car, I guess. And then the next thing he knows, he's driving along in his car on the same Route 40. He's farther along the trip, and he gets to the bar or restaurant where he was headed, and his buddies say, "What took you so long? You're 2 hours late," or words to that effect. And he can't figure out what the hell is going on, how to get to be 2 hours late. Somehow, I forget the details of how, somehow he managed to get in contact with Bud Hopkins, and under hypnosis, it turns out that his recollection under hypnosis was that he's driving along, this bright light is moving around over his car. All of a sudden, this car drives off the side of the road, off into the grass or something, and stops. this thing comes down onto the ground. Some creatures come out of it, open up the side door of his car, float him out. Standard, what we now know is a standard abduction type of stuff.
Yeah.
Happens. He gets put back in his car, and he's driving along. Suddenly he's back to consciousness. I think he consciously remembered before hypnosis, he saw this light, and then he sees it again as it's going away from him or something like that.
Yeah.
And the hypnosis filled in the missing time period. That's what it amounted to.
Okay, so
he said his evaluation of this whole thing was, he says, I believe in the UFO sighting. There was some bright light moving around relative to my car. But he says, I don't know if I believe in this abduction stuff. That came out under hypnosis, and I'm just not sure of that. Now, for somebody to evaluate his experience, his own experience in that sort of a critical manner, tells me this guy's not a nut.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's more likely that something like that did happen, whether it's all a screen memory for something else, or whether things happen exactly as you recalled under hypnosis. I don't know. But that certainly seemed to be a credible experience as far as we were concerned. And that's what sort of shifted the cases like that, or what shifted the paradigm. But things got really weird, people being translated through walls, or open or closed windows and stuff. How is something like this done? I don't know. Is this a form of technology? Probably is, I suppose.
Yeah.
Any technology that's hundreds of years in advance of you is going to appear like magic, says Arthur C. Clarke.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like you're plugging along here, nuts and bolts, and then things explode and sort of give you pause to look at this in a whole different sort of way. Is that kind of fair?
The Roswell effect of the Roswell case was that, we don't understand the real history behind UFOs, because there's a history associated with the Roswell crash that's independent of the history that we know about Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book, and UFO civilian investigations.
Yeah.
So there was that paradigm shift in the Roswell case, that there may be hardware after all somewhere. And then again, this other paradigm shift related to, creatures from outer space may be interacting directly with human beings and doing nasty things.
Yeah, you don't sound too excited. Yeah.
In the 1980s, we started getting crop circles, or I should say agroglyphs. Agroglyph is the correct term.
Yeah.
Pictures drawn in agricultural crops. And I bring that up because that's added into the initial agroglyphs were quite simple things, but they were an extension of landing traces. Landing traces were typically associated with the craft that made the landing trace. In other words, a person would come upon an object on the ground, see it take off, go over to where it was, find depressed grass, burned grass, impressions in the ground, something like that, right?
Yeah.
As these things became more complicated, the question was, this is much more than just something landing. So what really is going on? I'm talking about the early agroglyph problem, conundrum that was in the middle 1980s. This is before, all of a sudden, in 1990 or 91, all of a sudden you had this huge explosion of complex diagrams. But up to that point, it was primarily just combinations of circles. Or I might also mention animal mutilations. There's another thing that gets thrown into the pile here, and that was sort of started in the middle 60s with a horse, as you may know, and became a real problem for people grazing huge herds of cattle out in the plains in the 70s. And it was a sufficient problem that they even hired a retired FBI guy to investigate and try to find out if there was a religious cult killing cows or something more bizarre than that, or if it was just animals. And in the late 70s, his report said that it was just effects of animals, but that didn't explain things like straight knife-like cuts, loss of blood with no blood on the ground, stuff like that.
Yeah, it just became a huge melting pot, it seems like, in the 1980s. Now, let me sort of go down a different rabbit hole here. Now, I know you've sort of suffered the slings and arrows of skeptics and debunkers over the years, notably Phil Klass. I guess just talk a little bit about that, because it seems like you've had to, defend the subject, defend the phenomenon against the, for lack of a better term, non-believers. I mean, these are ardent non-believers who it seems like that's their job to not believe.
Most of the skeptics, debunkers, whatever, really were uneducated about the subject. Most people I run into, and that apparently goes for the modern day, the skeptics of choice today, for example.
Yeah.
But Phil was a little different. He actually studied the subject. And the history of Phil Klass is that he, in the 50s, already was dabbling a little bit in the subject. He was a writer for Aviation Week. He knew a lot about. He didn't have a PhD or a BS or any degree in science, but he was well-read in aeronautics, avionics, and so on. And so he was continually writing columns for Aviation Week.
Yeah.
And I think it was in the middle 50s that he first proposed that some UFO sightings might be related to plasmas. But he really pushed this subject in the latter 60s. Recall I pointed out there was a big flap in 1965 and 66, which resulted ultimately in the Conan Report. Well, about the same time, Phil decided to write his first book called UFOs Identified.
Mm-hmm.
He has on the cover of that book a picture taken by a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot from an altitude of about 40,000 feet, looking downwards into a collection of thunderheads, cumulus clouds, and there's this bright, overexposed image, almost football-shaped. It's on my website, analysis of this case on my website. And incidentally, this is one case that BOAA includes in his compilation of physical evidence cases. So anyway, Phil put this book one on his front page, or on the cover page, the cover leaf, I should say, and it talks about it inside the book, of course. And the whole book is his arguments attempting to show that the true UFOs, the ones that really can't be explained, the ones that aren't misidentified, are actually plasmas. And plasma is it's been called the fifth state of matter, but it basically means that you separate the electrical charges throughout a volume, and that means it becomes highly conductive, and it reflects radio waves, and it glows in the atmosphere, and so on.
Yeah.
So anyway, he's claiming that the UFO sightings that aren't misidentifications and hoaxes are in fact plasmas, and he cites that particular case as an example of a gigantic plasma, even though scientists believe that the only plasmas, aside from lightning strokes themselves, the only natural plasmas lying around, say Elmo's fire or something, maybe ball lightning, are small.
Yeah.
Anyway, Phil published his book thinking that ufologists and everybody would be real happy to just come up with a good argument for how it's all plasmas. And instead it got panned, and in particular panned by James McDonald.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of a real nasty feud between McDonald and Klass. Of course, that ended when McDonald committed suicide in 1971 for reasons unrelated to UFOs, related to his own family situation, had nothing to do with the UFO situation.
Yeah.
Anyway, by the time I got involved, Phil had written a second book called UFOs Explained, in which he didn't even mention the first book. And some of the cases in the second book were from the first book, but like I said, they didn't refer to the first book because the first book had been completely stomped on by McDonald and other scientists. Nobody believed that Klass had solved the problem, not even the PSYCOP guys, the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal.
Wow, that's strange. Let me ask you then, a lot of people speculate that Klass was, on the take, that he was working with the government, that he was, tasked to debunk. What do you think of that whole, train of thought?
Well, I think in that sense he might have been a useful idiot. in that he was doing what he thought was right, he was doing what he believed in, and it probably agreed with what the government wanted him to do, but I don't think he was necessarily being paid by the government to do it.
Okay.
I remember that my first contact with Funny Phil.
Funny Phil, I like that.
1974, I think, and it had to do with the McMinnville photo case. In his book, UFOs Explained, he discussed the McMinnville photo case. This is coming out after the Condon Report. The Condon Report study involved this astronomer Bill Hartman, who did a number of photo cases, and Bill Hartman's premier case was the McMinnville photo case, in which Bill Hartman has said that he couldn't explain the case. He said, you couldn't positively rule out a hoax. As far as he was concerned, everything investigated. And he actually went and talked to the witnesses. He said everything investigated seemed to point towards an extraordinary flying object having passed within the sight of two witnesses. So this is a premier case in the Condon study.
Yeah.
If the subject had appealed to scientists, then there should have been a huge reaction to what Hartman wrote.
Exactly.
I'm sure Hartman expected a huge reaction to what he wrote, because he was essentially saying, look, this UFO is real. And the picture is so clear that it's obviously not a bird or a plane or Superman. It's some circular object, primarily circular anyway, with a pole on the top that was zipping by. So anyway, it attracted my interest. I was wondering, why haven't there been a whole bunch of articles written on this one case? Why hasn't it been reinvestigated? So in late 73 or 74, as a result of this flap of sightings that happened in 73 that got me really interested in the subject, I decided to see what I could do with the McMinnville case. And the first thing I needed, of course, were some good pictures. And I knew that Phil had put them into his book, UFOs Explained.
Yeah.
And I had read that book. Actually, I gave it a reasonably good review and published the review in NICAP, UFO Investigator. So anyway, I called up Phil to find out how I could get some copies of the pictures. And I don't remember much about the conversation, except he said, I recall him saying the following: I'm a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic. And as far as he was concerned, there wasn't any case that couldn't be explained one way or another. And any case that couldn't be explained was a plasma. And since it didn't appear that the thing in the McMinnville photo case was a plasma, it must be a hoax. But anyway, he was willing to help me with getting prints.
Yeah.
And in fact, I did get some prints from Robert Schaefer, one of the people working with Phil at the time. And I learned what it was. I did my homework, you might say, learning how to do the Hartman type of calculation that led to a calculated distance to the object of over a kilometer and therefore a size of over 30 meters and so on. I learned how to do all that stuff. In the meantime, I was trying to see if I could get the original negatives to work with. And that led me to, Phil made a suggestion that I write to or contact the editor of the newspaper that published the pictures. We knew that Hartman had found the negatives in 1967 in order to analyze them. He had them, and then he mailed them back to the UPI photo people who keep track of all the photos ever taken, I guess.
Yeah.
And when I tried to contact them, they didn't have it, didn't know where it was. So Phil suggested I contact the editor of the newspaper and see if he knew anything. So I called up a guy named Philip Bladine, now deceased, but he was the editor. He was the owner of the newspaper, an editor who had been active as early as 1947. In other words, although he personally had been out of town at the time of the event, and his photo editor had done the story. Mm-hmm. So I call up Phil Bladine and I say I'm interested in the McMinnville case and I'm trying to do some analysis, and I'd like to know if we know the photographs were used, the original negatives were used by the Condon study, and they don't know where it is. And I wondered if you had any idea where we might look. And he says, "Oh yeah, they're right here on my desk."
Oh wow!
This was in '74, I believe, when he had found out that the Condon people had returned the photos. He had written to the UPI people and said, "Send them to me, and I will return them to their owners." the Trents had never been paid for these pictures. It wasn't that anybody owned the pictures but the Trents. So Bladine got the pictures in 70 or 71 and put them on his desk and never got around to giving them to the Trents. That's why they were still sitting there in 74 when I called.
Oh, wow.
So I arranged with Mrs. Trent to allow me to use the pictures, and I used the original negatives. And I was bad boy too. Told her I'd like to keep them for a few weeks for analysis. I actually had them for about 20 years, I guess.
Wow.
Now, during this time, when I was doing the analysis of the Trent case, and when I first published my first paper on it, Phil was rather silent on the whole thing. But after I published the first paper, in which I duplicated the result that Condon had found in terms of distance, this is a paper published by the Center for UFO Studies.
Yeah.
When I completed that paper, that sort of put me on the map, because here I had tackled the premier case in the Condon study, and by adding some corrections to what had been done before, came up with the same sort of result, that the thing was far away. But I also pointed out that this was based on photometry, so if they had been fortunate and chosen certain brightnesses for their object, it could be close and appear to be far away. In other words, I couldn't rule out the possibility of a hoax, but they'd have to be very lucky. Well, Phil got into big arguments over all sorts of other non-photographic type of stuff in the story. I mean, the story is not 100% consistent, but 100% consistent, you'd suspect a hoax anyway. People remember things differently.
Yeah.
This is two people who are trying to remember what had happened weeks or months later. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because this is how I got in contact with Phil.
Mm-hmm.
Where Phil and I really bumped heads was in the New Zealand case. The New Zealand film case.
Yeah.
December of 1978, when there was a freighter aircraft with a news crew on board flying along the east coast of the South Island of New Zealand and seeing lights appearing. They were doing this as a news story initially, just as a amusing news story about previous sightings along that same route. Mm-hmm. This is the middle of the night, and a freighter aircraft flying from Wellington, New Zealand down to Christchurch. Well, I happened to be in the right place at the right time because of my connections with NICAP to be asked to investigate that film. Although when I first saw it on TV, I thought, it was 12,000 miles away from me on the other side of the earth. I figured somebody thousands of miles away might get a chance to look at it, but I wasn't going to worry about it.
Yeah.
That was it was first shown on, I think, a Monday night in January of 1979, and I sort of looked at it and said, well, what the hell, there's nothing for me to worry about. And about 4 days later, I got a call from the guy who was the director of NICAP at the time, Jack Akoff, and he said, how'd you like to see the New Zealand film? They're bringing it here.
Oh, wow.
It took me about 4 microseconds to say, sure. And less than a week after it was taken, I had it at my house, and I was using a projector to run the 16-millimeter color movie that had been sold at $50,000 a shot to a number of news organizations around the world as a documentary. So anyway, I analyzed that film, concluded that there were a lot of UFO things that actually happened. About a year later, in 1980, I got my first letter from Phil about this particular case. And he was asking about some of the radar and stuff, as I recall in the first letter. It was one of those things where if I had known what was going to happen, I'm not sure I would have bothered to even answer his first letter. Several years and maybe 1,500 pages, single-spaced of typing later.
Oh, wow.
I don't know, it's like 3.5 3-inch ring binder notebooks. We went over every fine detail.
This isn't over until I say it's over!
You're listening to Banal of America Audio.
I will smash your face into a jelly!
Now, I should say that when you do a UFO investigation, you never know what you're going to get into. in the McMinnville photograph case, one of the things I wanted to know about was the size, the diameter of the wires that go over that appear at the top of the picture.
Yeah.
Well, how do you figure that out? I wanted to figure out the size. I want to know what the size of the wires was so I could use the photogrammetric method of calculating the distance of the camera from the wires. So I had to make a study of those wires. I had to look up an old electronics book and find out what the diameter of the old-fashioned type of insulation on 14 gauge or something like that, copper wire.
Yeah, this is serious business. Yeah, wow.
You know, who would think that this isn't related to UFOs?
Exactly.
There were numerous other aspects that you get into, and in the New Zealand case, there are all sorts of things because the New Zealand sightings that I was investigated took place late at night in the early morning of December 31st, 1978. They involved 6 witnesses. Let's see, what do I say? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 6 witnesses. Well, 4 different witnesses. And actually pilot, co-pilot, and 2 reporters that were involved as eyeball witnesses. And then there was a Wellington Air Traffic Control Center guy watching the screen on the radar, and the radar tape, which allowed us to reconstruct this whole trip. And then there was a tape recording made on the plane by the reporter who happened to be on the plane, as I said, trying to do a little story on previous sightings.
Yeah.
And he got caught in the middle of something that changed his life. At any rate, all sorts of aspects of this came in, the radar and cameraman with a 16-millimeter color movie that I had to analyze, thousands of frames of information. And, of course, just interviewing the witnesses. I actually flew to New Zealand and Australia to interview all the witnesses myself. So anyway, I had written a paper based on this that said essentially that there was something real there. And then Phil contacted me about a year later and started asking questions about the technical details. And over the next, that was 1980, over the next 2 years roughly, we probably exchanged something like 1,500 or more pages, single-spaced, of text. Questions by him, answers by me, questions by him, answers by me. Sometimes I asked him questions and he gave answers. It really was a very finely ground up case, you might say, by the time we got finished with it.
Indeed, yeah.
And he wrote about it in his book, his 3rd book, UFOs, the Public Deceived, which is aptly named because he deceived the public in his book. And in particular, in the New Zealand case, there was one section of this film which shows a flashing light that flashes from large white images to small, dim orange and red images. The orange and red images, that's a little triangle with an orange dot up above 2 red dots that make a triangle shape. And the white images have no trace of red in them, but they're much bigger. They're like overexposed white images. And there was 30 cycles. The cameraman got 30 cycles, I think it was, and about 1 cycle per second starting. Well, the camera was running at 10 frames a second, and it took about 10 frames to complete a cycle from maximum brilliance to minimum brilliance and back to maximum again. This is just one part of the New Zealand sighting case, but it's perhaps the most interesting part from the point of view of Phil's handling of it. Phil wrote in his book that the images are hot dog shaped, that is often bent curves, and of course the cameraman was holding the camera on his shoulder on a moving airplane.
Yeah.
And so naturally the image of some light way out there in space, which by the way apparently was picked up by Wellington radar and seen by the pilot and co-pilot and a reporter. This light out there was bouncing around in the film, and so you see it moving around in the film. And when you have an exposure time and some object moving during the exposure time, it leaves a trail.
Yeah.
It elongates the image. So you've got these various elongated images, various lengths and various shapes and so on. And Phil decided that Phil knew one thing that I had told him, which was on the top of the airplane there was a red rotating beacon. This is a typical thing for an aircraft to have.
Yeah.
and the beacon rotates at 1 cycle per second. Once every second, you get a red shot, a shot of red in your eye, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And that was essentially the same rate that we were getting for this flashing light that was changing from white to red, bright white to dim red orange. Well, Phil conceived of a method whereby the cameraman could stand inside the cockpit and film the light on top of the aircraft. Now, he had already filmed the light on top of the aircraft before the airplane even took off. He was standing on the tarmac with his camera and running his camera in, he said, by taking film of the airplane before it even took off. And his film shows a red rotating beacon on the top, and when the red rotating beacon is pointed right at the camera, the image is a yellow dot in the center, a yellow disc in the center with a red fringe around the outside. The red fringe around the outside tells you it is red light. When the light is dim, pointing in the other direction, then you just get a dim red image. So anyway, Phil's claim was that light from this red beacon was bouncing off the rotating propellers and into the cameraman's lens. That would mean that the cameraman was not looking in the direction ahead of the airplane where this thing was spotted, but he had to be looking sideways, right in front of the co-pilot, really, to be able to be pointing his camera towards the propeller.
Yeah.
So Phil invents this scenario where the cameraman is looking to the right, looking at the propeller, filming the red light reflected off the propeller. And Phil argues that the craziness of the image shapes and so on was due to the fact that there was no synchronization between the propellers and the frame rate of the camera. If you read his article and you know nothing about the case at all except what he wrote, this may sound plausible as an explanation for this flashing light. What the reader doesn't know is that I proved to Phil that it was physically impossible, optically physically impossible for that to be true. And the clue was in these pictures that the cameraman took before the plane even took off. Remember, I said that the flashing light images run from very bright, large, white, overexposed with no red fringe at all, just a white image, to a dim triangle of red and orange. The big white images by themselves are just plain white, overexposed, maybe with a trace of orange or yellow, but there isn't any red. And so the cameraman could not have been filming the red beacon, even reflected off the propellers, because if he had been, the overexposed images would have had red around them on the outside.
So even though you explained all this to him, he just went ahead with his own sort of...
Absolutely.
Interesting.
I mean, that was just Phil doing his dyed-in-the-wool skeptic.
Yeah. Now
maybe he didn't believe what I told him, but I was honest with him, and in terms of all my analysis that I did for him, there were numerous cases where he would propose an explanation for some particular part of the sighting, and that would mean that I would have to check out his explanation and see whether it made any sense or not. And this has to be one of the longest correspondences, certainly one of the longest correspondences on a UFO case, maybe one of the longest correspondences in history on some particular complex of rare phenomena, shall we say.
Sounds like a real cat and mouse.
The fact that he was willing to put that into his book, even though I had told him that it was wrong. The physics matter. There's absolutely no way that he could have gotten a white overexposed image by filming red light reflected off the propeller. Phil went ahead and published it anyway. That's why I say his book is aptly named UFOs the Public Deceived.
Exactly, yeah. Now, you've talked about a lot of your research here into the photos and everything. Now, what do you think of this the way things have changed now? We're in the digital age, and it seems like any photos of UFOs always now have this, shadow of suspicion cast over them because the ability to tinker with photos is so easy for, an armchair hoaxer or, maniac or skeptic or whatever.
Yeah, but this has always been true. A photo a UFO does not make. You've got to have the background. Now, it is possible for a dedicated hoaxer to create a context for the photograph that is a story behind it.
Yeah.
Which makes sense in terms of the photograph, and therefore you hoax the whole thing. In the McMinnville case, for example, you have the testimony of the witnesses taken several different times by different people over the years. And the fact that I personally talked to Mrs. Trent, the female witness, 24 times over a couple of years. And she was consistent with me. you have to have the background. I could not prove that the Trent photo was real just by the photo itself. I would have to admit that they could have been lucky and hoaxed it. For example, you have overhead wires, that is, wires that appear at the top of the picture. If they were suspending the model from the wires, then they were stupid to show the wires. But anyway, the Trents weren't that smart. So let's suppose that there was a string hanging this model from the wire. It had to be thin enough so that you could, strong enough to hold the model, but thin enough so it wouldn't show up on the film.
Yeah.
There has, of course, been numerous examinations of the original negatives looking for that incriminating thread. No one has found it. That doesn't mean that there's nothing there. If they picked a thread with the same color as the background color, there'd be no contrast between the thread and this background sky, and there'd be no way you could see it. You only see things because of contrast. As a matter of fact, all of life is just contrast. If everything were the same, boy, would it be boring.
That's deep. Yeah, I like that.
So anyway, the point I'm making is, yeah, it's true that it's easy to come up with fake photographs, but you've also got to fake a story and make it stick. And it has to stick under well, another thing is, the closer you get to having a, quote, real UFO being coming out of a particular case, look at it like this. You begin the investigation to find out if something is real. You're taking a series of steps towards a conclusion, right?
Yeah. Imagine
you're walking up a hill.
Mm-hmm.
This hill gets steeper and steeper as you walk. So you go along a certain way, and things seem to be convincing so far, and then you take another step, ask another question about the case, and it's kind of hard to generalize because each case is different. But the closer you get towards a conclusion of anomalous, the harder it is to take the next step.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And you can never actually get to the top of the mountain because
you can't you could in principle get there. There might be some case that is so good that no matter how you beat on it, it doesn't fall apart.
That's true, I suppose. Yeah, that's true.
That is let's say, the holy grail of ufology, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You can look at all sorts of cases that ask, do they meet that criterion? One of them, which is going to be in Leslie Kean's new book, UFOs, the Government, and whatever, I forget the total title. I suppose you're aware that it's coming.
Oh, yeah.
The JAL 1628, the Alaskan jumbo jet 747 that flew over Alaska, heading southwestward over Alaska, and had the crew had sightings as they went along, and I wrote what is the most detailed analysis of that whole case. It's been publicized recently in the last 10 years by John Callahan, who was in charge of the investigation, the FAA investigation, which lasted a day or two, I guess. I was able to do complete analysis of that because I was given documentation and allowed me to reconstruct the airplane track and listen to the audio tape and reconstruct I published the whole thing in the IUR 1980. In that particular case, and Phil figures into this as well, that particular case essentially began with two objects appearing right in front of the jumbo jet as they flew along. The pilot said he felt heat on his face. There seemed to be collections of flashing lights or exhaust ports or something like that on two objects that at first appeared one up above the other, if I recall correctly, and stayed that way for a couple of minutes traveling. They just appeared in front of the airplane that was doing 600 and some miles an hour.
Yeah.
And then they suddenly reoriented to be side by side, and these objects are rather complex. The pictures that the pilot drew of these objects is a rather complex collection of what he thought might be exhaust ports or something like that, but he wasn't really sure. And things developed as he went along his track. He's heading from the northeastern corner of Alaska down towards Anchorage, or towards Fairbanks, and then down south to Anchorage. As things developed as he went along, these objects first appeared one above the other for a couple of minutes, and then side by side for maybe 10 minutes, and then they suddenly disappeared. And the pilot looked around, and he saw off to the left, saw a glow. He turned on his airplane radar, got a big radar target reflection from that direction. Then it sort of drops back, and he's the only person who now can see anything. And he looks, as he approaches Fairbanks, he looks behind to the left, out his pilot window. He's looking to the left, and he sees what he calls a silhouette of a gigantic spaceship.
Oh boy!
That's all. That's all history of this particular case.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very well documented. Yeah.
And you can see again. This is something you can read on my website. My complete report on it, which is tons more complete than anything the FAA did.
Yeah, that's no surprise.
That happened in November of 1986. The FAA said they were going to investigate starting early January of 1987. In March of 1987, March 5th of 1987, they presented their final report on the case. The final report, well, I should jump back a little bit before. During the sighting itself, ground radar was involved. Ground radar, Anchorage Air Force Base, Anchorage, Alaska.
Yeah.
And Elmendorf Air Force Base, which is also at Anchorage, near Anchorage, Alaska. This was either one radar being operated by two people or two separate radars. I think it's one radar that's got two operators. In any case, there was at least one point where the Elmendorf Air Force Base operator thought that the plane had some object behind it. And the Air Route Traffic Control Center guy told the airplane about this radar contact. And so when the Japanese crew finally got to Tokyo, and that was in November, and over the next few weeks they told their buddies that this had happened and radar had been involved, and that story got to a American reporter in Japan, and he called up Anchorage and asked if that happened, and Anchorage public information officer said yes, it did happen, and so he wrote a story about it, and the excrement started to fly, and that's when it hit the fan, and the FAA said, well, we better investigate because radar was involved. So now 3 months later in March, they say, well, it was all a radar mistake, and they didn't say a thing about the visible sightings. The visual sightings were completely ignored by the FAA. Well, now, several weeks earlier, CSICOP, Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, came up with their solution. Their solution was, of course, based on what Phil Klass had said, and he based his analysis totally on the transcript of the tape without knowing exactly where the airplane was flying. My investigation, I determined exactly how the airplane was flying, minute by minute, so I knew which direction the airplane was looking. But Phil didn't know which direction the airplane was looking. And so CSICOP presented their official explanation based on what Phil Klass concluded, that there really were two extraterrestrial objects involved with this sighting, Mars and Jupiter.
Oh, man.
And if you look at it, Mars and Jupiter were to the left of where the plane's heading was, but they were up there. However, to go from one above the other to side by side, Mars and Jupiter would have a tough time pulling off that reorientation in a matter of a few seconds.
Yeah.
So, one of the most obvious parts of the sighting was that it was one above the other and then side by side. The objects just sort of switched their orientation.
Yeah.
How wrong can you be on that? This is where you're walking along this ladder or climbing up the mountain towards proving something. You got three guys there. Could they all be wrong? The objects were side by side and then suddenly one above the other and then side by side. This doesn't even ask you how accurate could they be in describing the objects. It's just how accurate do you think they are in describing how the objects were oriented.
Exactly. Now we're at almost 90 minutes. Can you go a little bit longer? I got a few more questions for you. I won't keep you too much longer, I promise.
You stay all night if you want.
All right. Well, don't tell me that. We may be. Well, I want to also touch on some other aspects of your amazingly rich career here. Now, I was surprised to find out that you had some interaction with Rick Doty in the 1980s. And, of course, he's a pretty infamous figure in the world of ufology. So I guess talk about what your take on that whole thing was, as far as him, seeding troublesome information, I guess you could say, to the UFO community.
My interaction with him was based on the document obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, which was a report of a landing at near Kirtland Air Force Base, UFO landing near Kirtland Air Force Base. Again, this is something you can read about on my website. Look up the paper entitled "Welcome to the Cosmic Watergate."
Okay.
What I call a Kirtland landing document.
Yeah.
Is featured in there. The reason I got involved with Doty was because he was the person who had written this document, which said essentially that guards at the Manzano weapons storage area and another guard in the Sandia laboratory area had seen a strange object flying around the area one night in August of 1980.
Yeah.
There had, in this document, talks about some other sightings as well, but the key one was the one of August something or other. I forget the date. 1980.
I think it was 1980. Yeah.
You can read that document and find out all about it. But basically, some object was making zigzag maneuvers east of the Manzano weapons storage area. That was Manzano weapons storage area was where they had taken a small chain of mountains and put a great big double fence around it, drilled holes in it, stored nuclear weapons there.
Yeah.
And the guards traveled around this 24/7. And so one night they're traveling along and they see this thing going back and forth. All of a sudden it drops down behind another little mountain that's east of them. And shortly after that, a Sandia guard was driving along in a Jeep, comes up to what he calls an alarmed structure that is a building which has got a fence around it. And inside the fence is this bright object. So he takes his gun out of with him and starts to walk towards it. He couldn't communicate. All of a sudden he lost communications with headquarters. It was only like 4 miles away. He lost communication with headquarters, so he takes his gun and starts walking towards this bright object, which suddenly zipped upwards. And the story of that in the document says that the witness says it wasn't a helicopter, and the witness was a helicopter mechanic. So you're supposed to assume that because he was a helicopter mechanic, he knows something about what helicopters are like, what they sound like, what they can do, and so on.
Yeah.
The guards at the Manzano weapons storage area had seen this light drop down behind the mountain, and then sometime later they see the same light go zipping upwards at a high altitude and disappear. So it sounds like multiple witness UFO sighting, which would happen in 1980. Bill Moore got a hold of the document in December of 1980, I think. I'm not sure exactly. It was the summer of 1980 it was written. There were other things that happened with a guy named Benowitz in the fall of 1980, which we won't go into because that gets another complete story. But at any rate, in 1985, I think it was, I happened to be on a business trip for the Navy, attending a meeting at Kirtland Air Force Base, where Doty was stationed. And so I decided to see if I could get any further information on this case. I figured there should be a much more detailed story about what happened.
Yeah.
Just the little one document that was available. So I just dropped in on him, so to speak. I found out where the Air Force Office of Special Investigations headquarters was, and walked in and asked if Doty was there, and security guard said no, he wasn't. He'd be back after lunch, and to come back then. And so I left and then come back later and said I was here to see Doty, and he was gentlemanly about it. He didn't turn me away. Took me into his office. I stuck the piece of paper in front of him. Said, "Did you write this?" And he admitted that he did. And in the course of the conversation, he led me to believe, what he said led me to believe, maybe erroneously, but what he said seemed to me that there were other documents that one could get on this particular case.
Yeah.
Now, to be accurate about this, there were other documents, but they had to do with the Benowitz stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They was all tied in together.
Yeah.
I was interested in this particular landing document, the landing case. Were there more documents on that? Anyway, I went back home, had some further correspondence with Doty about this, but then I wrote the Freedom of Information Act, and I said I want all copies of all the documents associated with this particular case. And what they sent me was the document that I had already, plus the Benowitz documents, which I also had already. So there was nothing new. So I wrote back to him saying, wait a minute, Doty implied to me that there was more stuff. And basically over a series of months, I got Doty into trouble with the AFOSI Freedom of Information Act guy by arguing that there should be more stuff available, and apparently they eventually brought Doty in and questioned him really what was going on.
Well, what do you think was going on? I mean, and to couple that, what was your reaction when everything came out about what Rick Doty was really up to?
Yeah, well, that all came out a long time after my involvement, and my involvement really just centered on this one event.
Yeah.
Trying to get further information on that. I have not had any correspondence to speak of with Doty since 1986 or 7 or whatever.
Do you think he was trying to get his hooks into you?
He wasn't trying to get anything out. He didn't give me that impression.
Okay.
He never told me anything.
Yeah.
Unlike Bill Moore, who's claiming that Doty was a major source of information.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Do you think?
Bill Moore, by the way, had investigated this landing several years before I got involved with it, and he had tried to talk to some of the witnesses. I wanted to get to talk to the witnesses too, but they wouldn't let me. Wouldn't get the first base on that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to say. Like,
as far as Doty's further activities are concerned, I've read about them. As I said, though, I have not been involved, and maybe just as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, well, that's what I was kind of trying to ask you. It sounds like he was trying to bait you, maybe with something. Maybe he was trying to rope you into something. That's just the impression I got from what you just described as far as the meeting went.
Well,
but it's all supposition, I suppose, right?
The implication, he gave me the implication that there were other documents and that I should write for them.
Huh.
I did.
Oh, weird.
And the only thing that I got was this stuff having to do with Benowitz, which is not what I was interested in.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, it seemed like I got Doty into trouble. Again, you can read this whole thing on my webpage.
Absolutely, yeah. Brumac 8K, number 8K.
Number 8, letter K, right.
That's right, .com. We'll have links all over the place for it anyway. All right, now, speaking of documents and stuff, as you said earlier, you're pretty well known for getting this just huge amount of UFO files from the FBI. But in the ensuing years, I guess, what's your impression of how, the FOIA has evolved and, the quality of materials that's been received, not just from the U.S. government, but also, how we're having these file dumps from world governments? Is it getting to the point now we're just getting overwhelmed with documents to the point where we don't really need them anymore, I guess? Do you know what I mean?
Well, when this major document search began was, of course, there have always been, I guess, document searches of some sort or other.
Mm-hmm.
Some Project Blue Book files were released in the 1960s. The Conan study released the so-called Robertson Panel Report for the first time. You could read basically the whole thing. But it wasn't until 1975, when the Freedom of Information Act was released, that things really began to roll. In 1976, the Air Force put Project Blue Book files. Remember, Project Blue Book closed in '69, and it was decided that rather than destroy everything, they would put it all on microfilm.
Yeah.
I think the documents still exist at Maxwell Air Force Base or someplace or other. But what you have access to is microfilm versions of stuff. And the microfilm became available in 1975, I think it was. And I started going to the National Archives. I was living in Washington, just outside Washington, D.C. It wasn't that tough to go down to the National Archives, spend a few hours. That was back in the old days when things were more or less easy to do.
Yeah.
You could walk back into the aisles of microfilm up the wazoo, and there were the 92 rolls of Blue Book microfilm standing on the shelves, just waiting for somebody to look. Well, there's 100,000 pages there, and you can go blind cranking from one to the next. You're supposed to have help by virtue of an index. The opening index of the microfilm file, the first roll, lists every case, 13,000 or some number like that. And you have to then go to the roll where that case is and search until you find it.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a particular case. And then the cases aren't all filed, and some are misfiled, and there's weird things. And one of them, the Rogue River sighting case that I like a lot, was buried in there by being split into pieces and so on. But anyway, I wrote for I was doing the McMinnville photograph investigation. Mrs. Trent had told me that 2 weeks or something after their photos had been published, an FBI man had come to their house and searched it. So I wrote to the FBI asking if they had any records on Paul Trent. And I said, as an aside, oh, by the way, if you have anything else, please let me know. I didn't expect to get anything because nobody had ever said that the FBI was collecting UFO sightings.
Yeah.
And even Ruppelt, Captain Edward Ruppelt, who I mentioned earlier in his book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, in that he said that the FBI had not been interested in the subject. So I didn't expect to get anything. I wrote when I wrote in 1970, fall of 76, I got back a letter saying they were supposed to respond within 10 days. So I got back a letter saying your request is number 37,256, or some big number like that. So I figured by the year 2010 I might hear something. Instead, it was May, I think, of 1977 that I got a phone call from a very surprised FBI agent who says, well, I dug up over 1,000 pages of stuff. I had no idea that the FBI did anything on this subject. And he said he'd be willing to pick out what he figured were the best pages and send them to me. That was back in the days when it cost money per page.
Yeah.
So that was fine, 416 pages or something he copied, and I paid $30 or $40 or whatever it was. Turned out that there were actually 1,600 pages. And it's now for the last 10 years or so, it's been on the internet as 16 PDF files, I think, whatever you can download.
No, but do you think that the power of these files has diminished over the years since there's been so many? And it sounds like back then it was quite a boon for you to find out this information.
Sure,
but now they're covering their tracks a little better.
What then was, it was old knowledge that was new information.
Yeah.
Now it's old knowledge that's old information because it's been around for so long. Nevertheless, people are still not thoroughly familiar with what's in the documents. In the FBI documents, there's a couple of documents that say, written in 1952, that say the top level Air Force people are seriously considering interplanetary spaceships. They told that to the FBI, but they wouldn't tell that to the general public. And you can read about it in my book, UFOs, the UFO FBI Connection. Also, I think I got something about it on the website. But after the FBI, then in December of 1978, you had the CIA that had been sued. Initially, the CIA said they had only the Robertson Panel report. Then, under a search, they came up with 900 and some pages of stuff that was releasable under the Freedom of Information Act request. The NSA ultimately coughed up some documents. And then in the middle 80s, the Air Force, well, these agencies are continually going through declassification procedures.
Yeah.
And so just under normal declassification, they came up with a declassification of Air Force intelligence files in the middle 80s, and we got more information coming out about what happened in the 1947, 48, 49 time frame. We're getting more and more information about what happened early on. So now we could write a better history. That's why my history, the UFO FBI Connection, for example, is a better history that could have been written even in 1977. I got the FBI documents. I nearly needed a whole bunch of Air Force documents to set the FBI documents in their context. The documents have shown, in general, that there was interest in keeping track of this situation, although there's no smoking gun in the documents. That is, there's nothing that says at a particular place at a particular time there was a piece of something or other, or that General so-and-so went on record as saying that such and such a UFO sighting actually involved an extraterrestrial spaceship. You won't find something like that.
Yeah.
What you did find, the FBI file about the interplanetary visitors idea, was even that was sort of like in the extreme, and they would have told the FBI only because the FBI was acting like a black hole. No one ever expected that the Freedom of Information Act would uncover those documents.
Yeah, exactly.
But it did. And so anyway, most of the document releases were up through the early 1990s, and then after that, they sort of fall off. In the United States, people have complained, hearing about all Spain and France and England and Australia and New Zealand and so on releasing documents, and they're saying, why don't they release documents in the United States? Well, the answer is they released stuff in the United States, probably released all that they're going to. No, there are very few formerly top-secret documents that have been declassified. And if this subject is really as important as we think it is, it's in the top-secret world that it would reside, and they're not releasing top-secret stuff.
Yeah.
So don't hold your breath. One question always is, what's this all about disclosure? When are they going to disclose? My feeling for years has been Uncle Sam's never going to admit to it until it's proven already. Then Uncle Sam will say, oh, well, we knew about it all along.
To sort of head towards the close here, you've been looking at this phenomenon for 40 years. In your learned opinion, what do you think is really going on here with UFOs, and do you think we're ever really going to find out the answer, whether it's through sheer science or via, some kind of government disclosure or an accidental disclosure or intentional disclosure via whomever is behind the UFOs, if you will? So that's sort of a large question, but I'm hoping that, you'll have a wizened answer for us on that.
If we ever find the answer, I suppose we probably will if we live long enough. But there's certainly a lot of people who think they'd have the answer right now. There are a lot of people who are speculating, people who admit they're speculating and people who don't admit they're speculating and claim they know the answer. As for me, I wouldn't claim that I know what's going on, but I know something is going on. Even conventional science doesn't even go that far. They think it's all misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions. And I think there's something really out there. But where they came from, what they're doing, why they're doing it, I don't know. I could offer speculations along with everybody else, but I don't know if that's going to do us any particular good. There's a group of people who are trying to do so-called exopolitics, which I think is probably something is needed in the form of some form of exopolitics, but not necessarily the way it's being practiced at the present time under this assumption that the guys upstairs are all good guys.
Yeah.
We don't really know. We can assume that they're doing whatever they want to do, and not too worried about the impact on us. Obviously, they're not being totally covert with what they're doing, otherwise there wouldn't be any sightings at all.
That's true, yep, absolutely.
So maybe the best guess that I can make is this is part of a learning program or an acclimation program. And after we're thoroughly acclimated to their presence, whatever that means, maybe then we'll know what the answer is.
Are you hopeful to see it in your lifetime, or do you think this is something that's going to last another 3 or 4 generations?
We have to know whether we face love, hate, or indifference.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, yeah. It's still that's the $65,000 question, or however you say it.
Yeah, 65 billion.
There you go. Exactly.
Maybe trillion. Getting close to the national debt.
Well, having been in this 40 years, are you happy that you've spent so long in this, or do you look back and say, shit, I wish I never went to that conference from NICAP back in the late 60s?
No, I don't think I ever said I wish I hadn't gotten involved in it. There may be other things that I wish I hadn't done or wasted time on, specific cases or something like that. But,
yeah.
As far as getting into it or out of it, no, I haven't haven't even contemplated what my life would be like if I hadn't gotten involved.
Interesting. Okay. Well, as we said, you've written countless articles. You've made just tons of speaking appearances, and you've got the 5 books: UFO FBI Connection, UFOs Are Real, Here's the Proof, Could UFOs Be Real, and Melbourne episode, Case Study of a Missing Pilot.
An Abduction in My Life.
There you go, An Abduction in My Life. Actually, looking at the title of your books, I did want to ask you, you wrote Could UFOs Be Real in 1991, and then you followed that up with UFOs Are Real, Here's the Proof. So I found that kind of interesting. Did you,
Well, the book, Could UFOs Be Real, is really...
The answer is yes, like...
supposed to be an educational book. I guess I wrote it. It was something that, so far as I know, was never widely published. The guy who was promoting that book, I don't think he ever got anywhere. There have been things on the internet available, for example, from Amazon that surprised me. Things that I never intended to be books per se.
Yeah.
That turn out to be stuff. The UFO FBI Connection, they'll sell for $200 or something nowadays.
Oh, wow.
Books that are out of print. The Abduction in My Life book is not out of print in the sense that I've got a bunch of clean copies of them.
Yeah.
But nobody knows it, I guess, so nobody asked me for them.
Until now.
It's mentioned on my website.
Oh.
So you can read some stuff about the books there.
Okay. And so what do you have cooking, for over the next few years? What do you have planned? You got any new books in mind, or what are you working on?
Well, probably just more of the same, case analysis and keeping up with the field. I have thought about writing. I could take all my case analyses, for example, put them into a big compilation, I suppose. But I don't know if anybody would really care, and a lot of that stuff's already on the internet. You get it for nothing. Why sell it as a book?
Now, well, you said keeping up with the field. Now, at the risk of pushing the snowball down the hill on another lengthy answer, because I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but, you've seen this thing grow and change since the late 1960s. Are you happy with the way it's turned out, or do you think it could be better? Do you wish that ufology would go in a different direction, or try something different, or stop getting involved in this conspiracy element of it? I mean, what are your thoughts on the way the field has changed over the last 40 years?
Well, 4 years ago, we expected the answer would be right around the corner, and it's been a long corner, and we're still turning. It's becoming a 4th, 5th, or 6th dimensional corner, I guess. I'm not really sure. The way it's changed has gotten probably a lot more complex, and you have people coming into the field that don't really have the grounding and the history that you used to have.
Yeah.
You have to read a bunch of books nowadays in order to understand what happened in the first 10 years. As a matter of fact, I've often argued if we knew really what happened in the first 5 years, we'd have the answer to the question. But the government prevented us from learning a lot of stuff that was known within the first 5 years, and established a tradition that there was nothing to it. So the scientists basically said, why should we pay any attention to UFOs? And we're still stuck in that tradition. We're trying to get to the proof somehow that there really is something going on, that a proof that is convincing to the scientific community.
Yeah.
Failing that proof, you just have a bunch of people running around speculating on what's going on. Some of them scientists, some of them not. Some speculations being reasonable, many of them not, I think. There's just a wider scope of things moving in ufology now than there were 40 years ago. And, of course, you have an extreme increase in information transfer rate. I mentioned earlier in this discussion that one of the cases I looked at years ago in the early 70s, it took weeks before we found out about it. Nowadays, you find out the next day.
Yeah.
Almost no matter where it is in the world.
Yeah, or in hours.
Somebody posts on the internet that they just saw something, and you know it within minutes.
Yeah, it's quite a remarkable change in the way things have been, and
it takes hours just to keep up with Facebook and my email.
I can't imagine you on Facebook, but I will take your word for it.
Well, you can look me up.
All right. Well, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show, giving us so much time, some extra time here. You've just had such a remarkable career, and I feel like we've really only scratched the surface, but you've given us a really amazing look at the sites and the cases and the personalities and the changes in the field that you've seen over the last 40 years. A really invaluable amount of insight here in the last hour and a half plus, and I really can't thank you enough. I'm sure this interview will be listened to and enjoyed by people for years and years to come, and will provide a wealth of information for future students of the UFO phenomenon. As I said, you're a legend in the field. It's really been an honor to get you on the program here and have the chance to examine your remarkable career. So thank you so much. I wish you the best of luck in your continued work, and look forward to reading more articles from you, and hopefully maybe another book someday, or just catching you at a speaking engagement at one of these conferences in the not-too-distant future.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a delight.
That does it for this week's edition of BOA Audio Season 5. Big, super huge thanks to one of the true luminaries in the world of ufology, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, for coming on the show, and as you heard, giving us so much additional time. Of course, you can find out more from him at his website, www.brumac.8k.com. That's BRUMAC.8k.com. Check it out. Moving right along now, even though we're kind of behind the times here on getting the episode out to folks, I do want to do some listener email, because this is, as I noted at the beginning of the show, episode number 2 of the final 4 of Season 5, and I definitely won't be doing any listener feedback on the final episode. So we've only got 2 more chances to do listener feedback, and I want to make the most of those opportunities. So let's dive into the BOA Audio listener feedback mailbag. I picked out 4 here for this week's segment. The first one comes from Mike in Minneapolis. Here's what he has to say. Thank you for all the awesome BOA podcasts and the excellent website. I've been listening to BOA Audio and reading the site for a while now, and have finally got around to sending you some much-deserved dough through PayPal. A suggestion for an excellent show for you to discuss on the Popcast is the Fox TV show Fringe. The show is an awesome mix of weird fringe science and interesting characters. John Noble as Dr. Walter Bishop is the best mad scientist on TV ever. The more I see of this show, the more I love it. Also, a suggestion for a guest on BOA Audio is to have Linda Moulton Howe back on the show. She's an excellent, fascinating guest. I love listening to her talk about UFOs, animal mutilations, crop circles, all very interesting stuff. She is one smart person who really knows her stuff. Thanks again for all the excellent audio and website content. I hope you will keep it up for many years to come. Signed, another, in parentheses, Mike from Minneapolis. Wow, bunch of different stuff there to respond to. First of all, thank you, Mike. I echo your hopes for many more years to come of BOA Audio and BOA in general. I want to thank you heartily for your donation to Banal of America. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be hitting people hard here as we close out another rousing season of Banal of America Audio, so allow me to thank you since you have made a preemptive donation. It's very much appreciated, and it will go a long way to helping us pay the bills that have accumulated over the course of Season 5. I've passed along your podcast suggestion to JV, and I have Fringe Season 1 on DVD. I'm going to check it out as soon as I can, because I want to try and get in sync with the new season when it starts soon. So stay tuned. There's a good chance we'll be getting to Fringe on the podcast. And finally, I would love to have Linda Moulton Howe back on the show. Trust me. I would say right now, obviously, since we've already taped all of Season 5, it's going to have to happen in another season. But I'm willing to bet we will have LMH back on BOA Audio at some point in the future. I love talking to her. I had a great time during that interview, and it really generated a lot of buzz throughout the world of esoterica. So having her back on the program would be great. That brings up a whole nother issue, Mike. You've preempted another aspect here of these final episodes of Season 5, and that is that it's time for guest suggestions from the BOA Audio listeners. Now, I know I say this at the end of every season, people send in tons of guest suggestions. Some of the folks end up on the air in the following season. Some folks don't make it on the show. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't send in your guest suggestions. Even if you sent them in last season and we didn't get your guest on, send it to me again. Tell me you really want to hear from this guest, and I'll do my best to get them on the program. I'm already putting together the list here for Season 6, and it's looking pretty cool. I'm bringing some old guests back. I'm bringing in some new folks for the program. It's going to be quite a mix of previous BOA audio guests, new guests, all kinds of different topics. So we're already putting all the ingredients together here for Season 6, and now it's time for you, the BOA audio listeners, to add your spice of choice to Season 6. You'll hear the contact information in just a moment. Allow me to thank Mike once again for the great email. I really appreciate the donation and the props about the program and the website. I know the BOA staff appreciates it as well. Next email is short and sweet. It comes from Billy in Aberdeen, Scotland, and he just says, "Love to listen to all your shows. Keep up the great work." Well, thank you, Billy. There's not much to say in response to that, but I wanted to include your email here at the end of the program because, as noted, you're writing all the way from Aberdeen, Scotland. I got to put together some kind of map here and get the push pins in on all the different countries that have contacted us. Billy, you have planted the BOA Nation's flag in Scotland. Much appreciated, sir. International listeners, I know you're out there somewhere. Send me your correspondence, and we will definitely highlight it here at the end of the program. Third email in the batch comes from Russell, also short and sweet. Here's what he has to say. "Please don't put anything more on about the fictional made-for-TV Lost series. It has nothing to do with UFOs, etc. Russell." I wrote Russell back. It sounds kind of harsh here, this email that he sent me, but he's a sweet guy and he's cool, so it wasn't in a mean-spirited way. And I can understand his point of view. I know a lot of folks didn't tune in to the Lost Cast series finale, even though we included it as part of Season 5. The big reason was because it was a 5-guest showcase there as we closed the book on the Lost Cast, and quite frankly, just a shitload of work for me. So I had to, table BOA audio for the week, and I didn't want to sort of let this one go and slip through the cracks. In addition to all that, it also sort of kicked off the Popcast, which we've been doing now, and hopefully Russell doesn't mind that I'm doing the Popcast. That way we can kind of keep the pop culture and esoteric separate here on the different BOA audio programs. So nonetheless, I don't expect to do another Lost episode of BOA audio anytime soon. I can assure you of that, Russell. But you never know what might come up in the future, and I'm not going to apologize for doing some non-paranormal shows every now and again. We can't do UFOs and Bigfoot and conspiracy theories every week. Sometimes there's a compelling story on the fringes of the esoteric that deserves discussion, and you're going to hear it on BOA audio. We're never going to shy away from those stories, folks, like our previous edition of the program here with Tim Donaghy. But I've heard your call loud and clear, Russell. Thank you for writing in. Don't worry, no more Lost episodes, but cover your ears. There may be some other pop culture episodes somewhere down the line in the future. I'm not going to ever close the book on that option. And finally, we got an email here from Bob, no hometown listed. Here's what he has to say. "I just wanted to drop you a line and let you know that I've really been enjoying Season 5 of Been All of America. The last 2 episodes on the Catholic Church and the deja vu phenomenon have been 2 of the best interviews so far. Your interviewing style of being friendly, open, and most of all interested makes for some of the best interviews I've ever heard, especially in the esoteric fields. I have to say I was not really interested in either topic before the shows, but I found both shows fascinating. Thanks for all you do. Keep up the good work. Bob." Thank you for writing in, Bob. Thank you for your kind words. I really appreciate them. And I really feel affirmed, I guess you could say, via your email. We've definitely gone off the beaten path here this season, although I think that was sort of the case over the last 2 seasons as well. I'm always open to the fringe of esoterica, as we just noted here for Russell's email, but especially stuff like, as you said, the Catholic Church situation and the deja vu phenomenon, as well as the Santa Muerte episode from a couple of weeks ago. There's so much stuff out there, folks, in the world of esoterica that just does not get the headline status of UFOs, conspiracy theory, and cryptozoology, also ghost hunting, of course, that a lot of these stories and topics sometimes slip through the cracks. And my goal here with this program is to highlight those stories and bring some of those folks on the show to talk about their amazing research into stuff that chances are a lot of folks listening to the program have never really heard about or considered in the first place, kind of like what Bob is saying here. To tie that back around to Mike in Minneapolis's email, not only are we looking for guest suggestions for Season 6, we're also looking for topic suggestions in Season 6. So if you have the opportunity and you have the idea for something you want to hear us talk about, shoot me an email and we will definitely dig into it. And as I said, if you've emailed me before, don't hesitate to do it again if I didn't get back to you or if we didn't get your guest/topic covered here in Season 5. We have limited slots. Scheduling can be difficult with some of these guests, and I will always be honest with you folks as far as what is going on with your requested guest/topic. And on that note, thank you to Bob for writing in, thank you to Russell for writing in, as well as Billy in Aberdeen, Scotland, and Mike in Minneapolis. All great BOA audio listeners, all had something cool or interesting to say here at the end of the program. How do you get in touch with me? How can you vie for a spot in the final BOA audio listener feedback of the season? And how can you get in touch with me to request a guest or topic? That's simple. Here are the means of communication. You can write to boaaudio@hotmail.com or just go to binallofamerica.com, BINNALL of America.com, and click the contact button. Also, you can go to the official BOA forum, the US of E.com, THEUSOFE.com. And of course, as I've been noting here at the end of the show for a while, there are all the different social networking sites we can find me: Twitter, MySpace, and Facebook. Just punch in Binall, BINNALL, befriend me, follow me, poke me, it's all good. And chances are you're going to get some cool inside nuggets via one of those social networking mediums. So those are all the methods. Trust me, I read all the correspondence I get. I try to write back to as many people as possible. Some emails slip through the cracks, but I like to think my record so far is at about 85 to 90%. Send me your feedback on the season as a whole or the last few episodes or anything you want to tell me, including thoughtful, constructive criticism. I can take it. I want your feedback, folks. And if it's particularly pithy or it hits on a topic I have been meaning to discuss here at the end of the show, it just may be included in the final BOA audio listener feedback segment of the season next week. Up next, of course, you know what it is. It is the thanks portion of the show. Allow me to roll through the list of the esteemed and infamous BOA staff: Leslie, Chiron, Regan Lee, Joe V, Tina Senna, Rochelle Hawks, Richard Thomas, Marla Pena, our contributing cartoonist Andy Carolyn, and our webmaster Jeremy Boston. 3 new columns at BOA since the last time you heard from me. Marla Pena's Shadow of the Shinigami looks at the crop circle enigma. Richard Thomas's Sci-Fi Worlds features an interview with author Lance Parkman. And Leslie's Gray Matters discusses the Manson family and why there seems to be a weird interest in that horrific crime and cult. We say it week in and week out here at the end of the program, but it is true, my friends. If you're only listening to BOA audio and you're not reading the columns at binallofamerica.com, then you're only getting half of the story. BOA, make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. I alluded to it briefly a moment ago, but it is time for me to come at you with my hand held out, folks, and ask for donations to the program and to BOA in general. The bills have been piling up here in Season 5, and I would like to get us on an even keel here as we close the book on the 5th season of BOA Audio. And in order to do that, it would be great if I could get some help from the folks who've been enjoying the program over the last 9 months or so. How can you help us out? That's simple. There are 2 ways to donate. You can just go to binallofamerica.com and click the PayPal button. That's pretty easy to find. They'll walk you through the whole process. It's very simple and very secure. maybe you don't trust the internet, maybe you don't trust those folks at PayPal, and you want to make a donation the old-fashioned way via snail mail. Well, we can hook you up with that, folks, because we have a P.O. box waiting for your mailed-in donation. Here is the address. Tim Benall, P.O. Box 232, Pinehurst, Mass. 01866. Let me go through that very specifically for you. It's Tim Benall, Binnall, P.O. Box 232, Pinehurst, Pinehurst, Mass. 01866. So all together now, it's Tim Benall, P.O. Box 232, Pinehurst, Mass. 01866. And as always, no donation is too small, and all donations go towards Benall of America and BOA Audio to help keep the website and the audio series up and running, freely available, and commercial-free for all of our great readers and listeners the world over. Next week on the program, it is the penultimate edition of BOA Audio Season 5, and we're welcoming another superstar esoteric researcher. This time around, it is Rosemary Ellen Guiley, and it is a wide-ranging jam session of an interview that covers just a myriad of paranormal topics. It would be virtually impossible for me to tell you all the different areas we cover, all the different avenues we go down. It's a very organic interview, and as I said, it is truly a jam session of the BOA mold. Rosemary Ellen Guiley not only has been in this field for almost 30 years or so, but she's also written over 40 books on just an amazing variety of esoteric topics. So there's so many different avenues we could have gone down in this conversation and did. So I'm really looking forward to people checking this one out. I really enjoyed it quite a bit. Despite the delay here in getting you episode 2 of the Final Four, I'm going to work my ass off to get you episode 3 sooner than this one came at you. I know I've been saying that at the end of the show for the last few weeks, but this time I mean it. So stay tuned to Benall of America for that coming at you, hopefully sooner rather than later. Plus, as an added bonus, at the end of the show, we're going to have a pop-in from our old friend Peter Robbins. He's going to preview the upcoming Exeter UFO Festival, where he will be making a pair of presentations, and I will be serving as MC. Of course, you can find out more about that at ExeterUFOFestival.com. Hope to see a lot of BOA Audio listeners in attendance. And on that note, we say goodbye here at the end of another edition of BOA Audio Season 5. Big, super huge thanks once again to Dr. Bruce Maccabee. It was a real thrill to have him on the show. Big thanks to Mike in Minneapolis, Billy in Aberdeen, Scotland, Russell, and Bob for writing in on BOA Audio listener feedback. And finally, of course, big thanks to all you great listeners out there. Thank you for your patience with this program. Thank you for sticking with BOA Audio and not just listening to the program, but writing in and supporting the show, making donations, and spreading the word about our creepy little esoteric podcast. I can't thank you enough, folks. You are the real voice of this program, and you are the fuel that drives the machine. Thank you so much for making BOA Audio a part of your esoteric audio playlist. And until next time, this is Tim Benall, thanking you for listening and signing off.